On the outskirts of a small town in the state of Maine, there stood an old, decrepit mansion. It was known among the locals as the Haunted House. People said an old man lived there, and he had a glass eye. He never ventured out and never spoke to anyone. The town's children were strictly warned not to go near the house. The story begins. Ryan, a curious young boy, had always been adventurous. When he heard his friends whispering about the mansion, he was immediately intrigued. One evening, he decided that he would uncover the truth about the house once and for all. As the town settled into its nightly routine, Ryan grabbed a flashlight and convinced his best friend, Jake, to join him. They snuck out of their homes and made their way to the old mansion. The heavy front door was locked with a rusted padlock, but they noticed a small window that was slightly ajar. They carefully climbed through it and entered the mansion. Inside, the mansion was covered in thick dust, and old furniture was scattered around. In one of the rooms, they discovered an ancient wooden table with a book resting on it. The pages were blank, but as soon as Ryan touched the book, a cold gust of wind blew through the room, and the lights flickered. Suddenly, an old chair creaked, and a shadow appeared before them. It was the old man, his face pale, and his one eye a glass orb. He smiled eerily and said, "Why have you come here? Do you know the secret this house holds?" Ryan and Jake froze, unable to speak. The old man removed his glass eye and said, "This eye sees everything, even what you try to hide. Now you can never leave this house." The conclusion. Without warning, the old man vanished, but his glass eye remained suspended in midair. It began to glow and stared directly at Ryan and Jake. The air around them grew heavy, and they tried to scream, but no sound came from their mouths. Their bodies felt paralyzed, as if they were frozen in place. By morning, the people of the town gathered near the mansion, having heard strange, terrified screams in the night. When they entered, they found the house eerily quiet, but the walls were lined with photographs, photos of Ryan and Jake, their faces frozen in sheer terror. It is said that the old man's glass eye had trapped their souls, and now it roams the town in search of its next victims. In the days that followed, the town became eerily quiet. People whispered about the strange events at the mansion, but most of them quickly moved on with their lives, as if nothing had happened. However, some of the braver children dared not forget what had occurred. Among them was Lily, Ryan's younger sister. She had always been close to her brother, and she knew something was terribly wrong. One night, unable to bear the silence any longer, she had overheard some of the older townspeople talking about a hidden room in the house, one that was supposedly locked away for decades. It was rumored to hold a terrible secret, something far worse than the ghost of the old man. Determined to uncover the truth, Lily sneaked out of her house and made her way to the mansion. The moon was full, casting long shadows over the desolate land. The mansion loomed ahead, its windows dark and menacing, as though it were waiting for her. As Lily approached, she could feel the weight of the place, an oppressive atmosphere that made her heart race. She slipped through the same window Ryan and Jake had used, and as she stepped inside, the familiar coldness and dust filled the air. It felt as though the house itself was alive, watching her every move. She made her way through the creaking halls, her flashlight trembling in her hand. After searching for what felt like hours, before she could react, a cold hand gripped her wrist, and she was yanked backward. The glass eye in her hand seemed to pulse, and the room began to spin. She heard Ryan's voice, faint and distant, calling her name. But it wasn't just Ryan's voice. It was the voices of everyone who had ever entered the mansion, trapped within the glass eye. They were all calling for help, their voices distorted and desperate. Lily struggled to free herself, but the grip on her wrist tightened. Rosine, boy. Her eyes darted around the room, looking for anything that might help. That's when she saw it, a crack in the wall. Desperation fueled her movements, and she rushed toward the crack, trying to break through. As the glass eye pulsed once more, the world around her fractured. The room dissolved into blackness, and Lily found herself back in the living room, the chest now closed and the tapestry hanging once again in place. But something had changed. Her heart pounded as she pulled the tapestry aside, revealing a dark corridor that led down into the basement. She took a deep breath, gathered all her courage, and descended into the darkness. The stairs creaked under her feet, and the air grew colder with every step. At the bottom, she found herself in a small stone room. In the center was an old chest, its surface covered in strange markings. Lily approached the chest cautiously, her hands trembling as she lifted the lid. Inside, there was a bundle of old rags and a small, intricately carved box. She opened the box, and what she saw inside made her blood run cold. It was the glass eye, glowing faintly with an unnatural light. As she reached for it, the temperature in the room plummeted. The walls seemed to close in around her, and the air turned thick with a suffocating presence. A voice, cold and hollow, whispered in her ear, "You should never have come here." Before she could react, a cold hand gripped her wrist, and she was yanked backward. The glass eye in her hand seemed to pulse, and the room began to spin. She heard Ryan's voice, faint and distant, calling her name. But it wasn't just Ryan's voice. It was the voices of everyone who had ever entered the mansion, trapped within the glass eye. They were all calling for help, their voices distorted and desperate. Lily struggled to free herself, but the grip on her wrist tightened. Rosine. Her eyes darted around the room, looking for anything that might help. That's when she saw it, a crack in the wall. Desperation fueled her movements, and she rushed toward the crack, trying to break through. As the glass eye pulsed once more, the world around her fractured. The room dissolved into blackness, and Lily found herself back in the living room, the chest now closed and the tapestry hanging once again in place. But something had changed. The glass eye was gone. Months passed, and the small town of Fairwood slowly returned to normal. The eerie atmosphere that had once loomed over the mansion seemed to fade away, but the residents never forgot about Ryan and Jake. Whispers about the cursed mansion still echoed in the streets, and parents warned their children not to wander too close. One chilly autumn evening, as the town's children played in the park, a strange occurrence took place. A young girl named Emily, known for her curiosity and boldness, was walking near the edge of the woods when she felt an unusual sensation, like someone was watching her. She turned around, but saw no one. Her footsteps quickened as she tried to ignore the creeping feeling in her chest. As she passed the mansion, the wind seemed to pick up, and the front door, which had always been locked, creaked open. A dark figure appeared in the doorway. Emily's heart raced, but her curiosity got the better of her. She hesitated for only a moment before stepping closer, drawn by an invisible force. The moment she stepped onto the property, the atmosphere seemed to shift. The air became thick with tension, and Emily's breath became shallow. She heard footsteps behind her, slow and deliberate, but when she turned around, no one was there. The door of the mansion slammed shut with a loud bang, and she was locked inside. Inside the mansion, the air was heavy with the scent of decay. The house seemed alive, groaning with age, and every creak of the floorboards echoed in the silence. Emily wandered through the dark halls, her flashlight flickering with every step she took. She passed the same room where Ryan and Jake had once discovered the mysterious book. Suddenly, she felt it, cold fingers brushing her shoulder. She spun around, her heart pounding in her chest. In the far corner of the room, she saw it. The glass eye, hovering in midair. It glowed with a dim, otherworldly light, and as it turned to face her, she could feel its gaze piercing through her very soul. "Who's there?" Emily called out, her voice shaking with fear. The glass eye remained silent, but seemed to draw closer, moving as if it were alive. She backed away, her eyes never leaving the eye as it floated toward her. It wasn't just an eye, it was a vessel of torment, a reminder of the souls trapped within it. Ryan and Jake's faces appeared, distorted and locked in terror, as if they were pleading for her to escape. The room began to spin, and the walls seemed to close in. The whispers grew louder, and Emily could hear voices, Ryan's and Jake's, begging her to leave. But it was too late. The eye was no longer alone. From the shadows emerged the old man, his hollow face grinning with satisfaction. "You thought you could escape this place, didn't you?" he said, his voice a low, sinister murmur. "But you cannot escape what the eye has seen." Emily tried to scream, but her voice was swallowed by the thick silence of the house. She fell to her knees, feeling the icy grip of the glass eye closing around her. In that moment, she realized the horrible truth. The mansion had always been a prison, and the glass eye was its warden, watching, waiting for the next soul to claim. As Emily's body froze in place, her image was added to the wall of photos in the mansion. And so, the cycle continued. The glass eye, ever watchful, would wait for the next curious soul brave enough to enter the house, but no one ever left. As the days passed, the story of Emily's disappearance became another whispered tale among the townspeople. People avoided the mansion, but the pull of its mystery lingered. No one dared to go near the old house, except for one person. Zane, a young man from the town, had heard all the stories. A skeptic by nature, he didn't believe in ghosts or spirits. He was convinced that there had to be a logical explanation for everything. The rumors of the haunted mansion, the glass eye, and the missing children, Zane thought it was all nonsense. He was determined to prove that there was no curse, no supernatural force. The mansion was just an old house, and he was going to explore it. One foggy evening, Zane, armed with nothing but a flashlight and his determination, made his way toward the mansion. As he approached, the wind seemed to pick up, and a chill ran down his spine. But he pushed forward, not willing to back down. The moccasin loomed ahead of him, its windows like dark, empty eyes. Zane felt a strange unease, but he dismissed it. "Just an old house," he muttered to himself. As he stepped into the mansion, the door creaked shut behind him. The air was cold and heavy, the scent of rot lingering in the air. It was just as the others had described it, dark, decaying, and unnervingly quiet. But Zane wasn't afraid. He wandered deeper into the house, his footsteps echoing off the wooden floors. He explored the familiar rooms, finding the same dust-covered furniture, the same decaying walls. But something felt different this time. As Zane walked down the hallway, he felt a sudden chill on his neck. A soft whisper brushed past his ear. "Leave." Zane spun around, but there was nothing there. The house was silent again. He shook his head. "It's just the wind." But as he continued forward, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. And then he saw it. In the center of a dimly lit room stood an antique mirror, its surface cracked and dirty. But in the reflection, Zane saw something that shouldn't have been there. The glass eye, floating just behind him, glowing faintly in the dim light. Zane froze. His heart raced as he realized it wasn't just a trick of the light. He spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty. That's when he heard the faint whispers, voices, soft and unintelligible, coming from all around him. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were deafening. He clutched his head, trying to block them out, but it was impossible. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw the old man. The figure was tall, hunched and shadowy, just as the townspeople had described. His one glass eye gleamed in the darkness, watching Zane with a predatory gaze. "You shouldn't have come here," the old man said, his voice rasping like dry leaves. "This place is not for the living. It never has been." Zane backed away, but his legs felt heavy, as if they were being weighed down by some invisible force. The glass eye seemed to draw closer, glowing brighter with every passing second. Zane felt his chest tighten, his breath becoming shallow. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. His body was no longer his own. The old man's grin widened, revealing teeth that were far too sharp. "The eye sees everything," he whispered, "and now it sees you." Zane tried to fight it, but the eye's power was overwhelming. It hovered just inches from his face, its cold gaze seeping into his very soul. And then everything went dark. The next morning, the townspeople gathered once more, this time to search for Zane. They found the mansion empty, the doors wide open. But as they entered, they were greeted by the familiar, chilling silence. As they explored the house, they found something new. On the walls, next to the photos of Ryan, Jake, and Emily, was a new image. Zane's face, twisted in fear, was frozen in time, trapped forever in the glass eye's gaze. And so the cycle continued. The mansion waited, its dark secrets lingering like a curse over the town of Fairwood. The glass eye, ever watchful, waited for the next curious soul to wander in. No one was ever truly free. Years passed, and the once vibrant town of Fairwood had become a shadow of itself. The people no longer spoke of the mansion, and the stories of the cursed glass eye faded into whispers. The mansion stood in silence, its decaying walls slowly being consumed by the encroaching forest. But beneath the earth, the curse never left. One day, a group of curious college students arrived in Fairwood. They had heard rumors of the haunted mansion from an old book of urban legends and thought it would be the perfect place for a weekend of ghost hunting. The group was made up of 4 friends: Claire, a skeptic who didn't believe in ghosts; Adam, an amateur photographer; Jenna, a history major fascinated by old houses; and Michael, who loved thrills and was always up for a challenge. The group spent the day exploring the town and gathering information from the few remaining townsfolk. Most people were tight-lipped, but one old man, sitting alone in the town's small diner, finally spoke to them. "You're planning to go to that house, aren't you?" the old man asked, his voice trembling with age. Claire, who was leading the group, nodded. "Yes, we've heard the stories and we want to see it for ourselves." The old man shook his head slowly, his eyes wide with warning. "No one who's gone there ever comes back the same. You won't be the first ones to walk into that place, and you won't be the last. But don't say I didn't warn you. That house, it has a mind of its own." With those chilling words, the man fell silent, and the group left the diner, their excitement tinged with unease. As they made their way to the mansion that evening, the sky darkened, and a thick fog began to roll in from the woods. By the time they reached the mansion, the air was cold and damp, the trees around them looming like silent sentinels. As soon as they crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind them with an unnatural force. Claire turned to check the door, but it was locked. She pushed against it, but it wouldn't budge. "This is just like a bad horror movie," Adam said, rolling his eyes. "Let's just get our footage and get out of here." But even Adam's bravado couldn't mask the unease that settled over them. They ventured deeper into the mansion, their flashlights barely illuminating the dark hallways. The wooden floors creaked beneath their feet, and the air felt heavier with every step. Jenna, the history major, paused to examine a dusty old painting on the wall. It depicted a family, an older man with a glass eye, a woman, and 2 children. The expression on their faces was eerie, their eyes hollow and unsettling. "This painting looks old," Jenna said, brushing the dust off the frame, but the room was still. No one spoke for a moment, the atmosphere growing heavier. Then, from the darkness ahead of them, the old man appeared. His figure was faint at first, but it soon grew clearer. He was tall and thin, with hollow eyes that glowed unnaturally in the dark. The old man stepped forward, his mouth curling into a twisted grin. "I see you've come to visit," he said, his voice low and rasping, like the rustle of dry leaves. Before they could react, the glass eye appeared, floating just behind him. It pulsed with an eerie light, and its gaze seemed to fixate on each of them, one by one. "I welcome the curious," the old man whispered, "but I warn you, this house is not what it seems. It feeds on your fear, your curiosity, and once it has tasted it, it will not let you leave." Claire felt her knees weaken, her breath growing shallow. "What do you want from us?" The old man's smile widened, his glass eye glowing brighter. "Nothing, except that which is already mine." Without warning, the room seemed to warp, the walls closing in on them. Shadows shifted unnaturally, and the whispers grew louder. Claire tried to move, but her feet were rooted to the floor, her body stiffening. The glass eye floated closer, its gaze unblinking. In that moment, they understood. The glass eye was no mere object. It was a trap, a force that had captured the souls of the past, and it was now targeting them. Michael screamed, but his voice was muffled by the overwhelming presence of the eye. Adam tried to run, but his legs gave way, and he collapsed to the floor, his eyes locked with the eye's gaze. The last thing Claire saw before everything went black was the old man's sinister grin and the cold, unblinking stare of the glass eye. The next morning, the mansion was once again quiet. The fog had lifted, and the town of Fairwood looked normal once more. But the mansion stood as it always had, silent and waiting. And somewhere, in the dark corners of the house, the photographs of the four students joined the others, Ryan, Jake, Emily, and Zane, trapped in the walls of the mansion. Their faces, forever frozen in fear, stared back at the next curious soul who would come seeking answers. As the years went by, the story of Fairwood's haunted mansion faded into obscurity. The town itself grew quieter, its residents growing older and more cautious. No one dared to speak of the cursed house anymore, and the rumors of the Glass-Eye's curse became nothing more than distant whispers. But deep within the mansion, the curse never wavered. It waited, patiently, for the next curious soul. The mansion was still. Its rooms, covered in dust, remained empty. The faded photographs on the walls of Ryan, Jake, Emily, Zane, and the four college students stood as the only witnesses to the mansion's dark history. They were more than just memories. They were the price the house had demanded, souls trapped within the glass eye, doomed to watch forever, to be forgotten by the world outside. And as the seasons changed and time passed, the glass eye, ever watchful, continued to glow in the darkness, waiting for the next curious visitor. And so, the cycle would never end.